Joining me is Col Richard Kemp, a retired British Army officer who commanded Operation Fingal in Afghanistan. He's reported a lot from Israel. He's in Australia to launch a documentary for the Australian Jewish Association, which is called Whose Land? Col Richard Kemp, it's great to see you again. The attack on Rafah, how do you expect it to unfold and what do you expect it to achieve?
Thank you, Andrew. It's really good to be with you. I think what we're seeing now is the preliminary moves by the IDF towards what looks like becoming a major ground and air offensive against Rafah. And the objectives, of course, of that offensive are to destroy the formed elements of Hamas which remain in Rafah, which are the main fighting components of Hamas that haven't so far been destroyed. And so ultimately, we'll obviously have to see how it works out. You can never predict how a battle or a war is going to unfold, but I would expect at the end of a campaign inside Rafah that we will see the final destruction of Hamas as a major fighting organization that threatens Israel.
Now, Colonel Kemp, there have been so many claims that Israel has been recklessly and even deliberately slaughtering civilians. Every civilian death is obviously tragic, and if only it could be avoided. But whether Israel has been reckless, I don't know. Hamas now claims that more than 34,000 Palestinians have died in this war, 70% of them women and children. I've seen statisticians actually saying that's impossibly high, that number. What do you believe? Is it 70% women and children dead among the casualties of this war?
I've been inside Gaza a few times since the war began on the ground with the IDF, and I've seen the way they fight, and they fight both from the ground and from the air with great caution, trying to everything they can to minimize the deaths of innocent civilians. And they've set up essentially an apparatus which is unseen in the Western world. No other army has achieved what the IDF have achieved in working to destroy their enemies while minimizing the deaths of the civilian population. And they've been, I believe, very, very successful. We can't, of course, believe the Hamas figure of 34,000, which I think they've also revised down to about 21,000 a week or so ago. But we can't take those figures as being authoritative. It might be that number, it might be more, it might be significantly less. We just don't know. But what we do believe, according to IDF estimates, is that they've killed something like 13 to 15,000 Hamas terrorists since the war began. If you do take the Hamas figures as being roughly accurate, but you then deduct from the overall figures, both that 15,000, 13,000, 15,000, and you deduct the people who have been killed by Hamas themselves, either by rockets dropping short, which is about 20% of all the rockets they fired, or by deliberate murder of their own people, which they've done on a large scale, plus death by natural causes, it brings you down, in my calculation, to a figure of less than one civilian killed for every combatant, which sounds terrible, and it is terrible, but it's much, much better than the United States, Great Britain, and other allies achieved in other conflicts. For example, it was 3 civilians to 1 combatant in Iraq and 5 civilians to 1 combatant in Afghanistan. So the IDF, through extraordinary measures, I think have achieved a very impressive civilian to military casualty ratio. Although even that, every death of a civilian is terrible, but it's very hard to avoid at all. It's impossible to avoid, particularly when Hamas are doing everything they can to try and maximize the deaths of innocent civilians inside Gaza.
Just one last thing, Colonel Kemp. China on the weekend dropped flares just in front of an Australian Navy helicopter in international waters off South Korea. This wasn't in Chinese waters, forcing the helicopter to take evasive action to save itself. How serious is that?
Well, I think it's a very serious act of aggression by China. But of course, we've seen numerous similar acts of aggression by China in this region. And I think it underlines, to me anyway, it underlines the importance in the bigger picture of things like the AUKUS deal with the US and the UK and Australia to try and put together a coherent alliance to try and counter Chinese aggression. I think this is obviously a single incident, but it's indicative, I think, of probably the ramping up we're going to see in over future years of Chinese aggression throughout this region, as well as elsewhere in the world. And let's not forget, going back to what we were talking about before, China's close alliance with Iran, which is behind, to a very large extent, behind the war in the Middle East, allied with Iran and with Russia. So those three elements of an axis of evil, you could call it, are a major problem for the Western world for the foreseeable future.
Colonel Richard Kemp, always great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.